In September 2024, Hurricane Helene tore through Appalachia and washed out the roads. Not some of them. All of them. In Yancey County, North Carolina, a man loaded a mule with insulin and climbed into a valley that had lost every bridge. In Tennessee, a retired nurse hiked across 3 ridges to deliver oxygen tanks to neighbors she had never met. For about 72 hours, the rest of America watched in disbelief. For Appalachia, it was a rerun. Their great-grandparents had done this every winter for nearly 200 years. The only difference was the rest of the country was not watching. Americans have a specific picture of the Appalachian winter. A log cabin buried in snow, smoke curling from a stone chimney, a lone family shivering through December waiting for spring. That picture is half right. Thus, it forgot the other 14 families in the hollow. Those families were not alone. They were plugged into one of the most sophisticated community networks in American rural history. Because the roads they had were not really roads, they were suggestions. So how did they actually pull it off? How did a region with no highways, no supply chains, and winters that regularly killed livestock survive season after season for 2 centuries? The answer is not what the stereotype tells you. It is better. And it explains exactly why, when Helene hit in 2024, almost nobody in those hollows panicked. Start with the geography, because the geography is the whole story. The southern Appalachians are not really mountains. They are the eroded stumps of mountains that were once taller than the Himalayas, here worn down over 480 million years into a tangle of ridges and hollows, so complicated that 2 families living 3 miles apart as the crow flies could be 20 miles apart by foot. The people who settled these hills in the 1700s were mostly Scots-Irish from Ulster, with pockets of Germans, English, Welsh, Cherokee, and black families both free and enslaved, whose contributions were systematically erased from the written record. They did not choose this terrain because it was beautiful. They chose it because nobody else wanted it. Flat land on the eastern seaboard was already claimed. The hollows were free. By the year 1800, these families had spread across roughly 500,000 square miles of ridge country, and the United States government did not build a paved road into most of it until the 1930s. For a century and a half, the infrastructure was whatever the settlers made themselves. Footpaths, bridle trails, old buffalo traces widened by generations of moccasins and hooves. In winter, even those vanished under snow. And that is where the real story starts. Because the trick was that winter did not start in December. It started in August. By late August, the whole cycle already had a name. They called it laying in. And if you did it wrong, you died. The first job was sorghum. Families would gather at one neighbor's cane patch, strip the leaves, haul the stalks to a mule-driven press, and boil the juice in long copper pans for 12 hours until it became molasses thick enough to stand a spoon in. One family might bring home 40 gallons, enough sweetener for an entire winter. Then came the apples. A good family orchard produced 10 to 15 bushels, some dried on the roof in slabs called leather breeches, some buried in straw-lined pits, some cooked down into apple butter in a 100-gallon cauldron over an open fire and stirred constantly for 18 hours so it did not scorch. By October, the cabbage went into kraut barrels. The potatoes went into root cellars, dug straight into hillsides, where the ground stayed at a steady 55 degrees all winter long. The beans hung in long strings from the rafters. And then came the part that modern folks still do not quite believe when you tell them. On the first hard frost, usually early November, every family killed a hog, sometimes 2, sometimes 4. The whole animal got used. Yes, the hams and shoulders went into the smokehouse, packed in salt for 6 weeks and smoked over hickory for another month. The fat was rendered into lard. The intestines became sausage casings. the feet got pickled, the head became souse meat, and the bladder, I am not making this up, got cleaned out and handed to the children as a balloon. By Thanksgiving, a small family cabin held somewhere between 600 and 900 pounds of preserved food. If this is the kind of American history you never got in school, then surely click the subscribe button. More forgotten stories coming your way. But food was only half the job. The cabin itself was a piece of survival technology most of us today have no idea how to read. Good ones were built on south-facing slopes to catch the low winter sun. The chimney was on the north side to block the wind. The logs were chinked with a mixture of clay, lime, and hog hair. The loft over the main room was where the children slept, because heat rises, and the chimney wall stayed warm until dawn. A spring house built directly over a running spring kept butter, milk, and meat cold without ice. And the spring itself never froze, because moving water rarely does. And then there was the network. This is the part the stereotype missed entirely. Appalachian families were not isolated. They were obsessively connected. A single hollow might contain 15 related households bound together by what locals called connections. When snow made the trails impassable, men would break trail on foot to check on elderly neighbors, a practice so routine it did not even get a name. It was just what you did. And women held what they called sitting-ups, round-the-clock vigils for the sick, rotating every 4 hours so someone was always awake next to the bed. When a baby was due in January, a granny woman, the community midwife, would snowshoe miles through drifts to get there, carrying ginseng, yellow root, and white willow bark in her apron pockets. The Foxfire Oral History Project in the 1970s documented granny women who had delivered hundreds of babies across decades of mountain winters, never losing a mother, charging whatever the family could afford. Sometimes a chicken, sometimes a jar of honey, sometimes nothing at all. And then the roads came. For all the genius of the system, it had a cost, and honesty demands naming it. Pneumonia killed. Tuberculosis killed more. Infant mortality in the Appalachian winter ran at rates that would today be considered a humanitarian crisis. In parts of eastern Kentucky in the 1890s, roughly 1 in 4 babies did not live to see their first spring. The hungry time came every March, when the smokehouse was nearly empty and the garden was still weeks away from producing, and families ate the last shriveled potatoes and waited for the ramps to come up in the woods. There are old mountain songs from this era that are not actually about love. They are about grief, about children buried in February, when the ground was frozen 3 feet deep, and the fathers had to wait for the thaw to dig a proper grave. So when the federal road building programs arrived in the 1930s, and followed by rural electrification in the 40s and the interstates in the 60s, the families welcomed them. Of course they did. Roads meant doctors. Roads meant jobs. Roads meant a child with pneumonia could reach a hospital in 2 hours instead of 2 days. But roads also meant something nobody quite predicted. They meant the connection networks began to weaken. Granny women gave way to clinics. Sitting-ups gave way to nursing homes. The coal camps pulled young men out of the hollows, and the Great Migration pulled the next generation up to Detroit and Cleveland and Cincinnati. By the year 2000, whole counties that had once held 15 related families to a hollow held 3 aging couples and a collapsing barn. And then Helene came. In September 2024, the storm dropped more than 30 inches of rain in 3 days across western North Carolina and East Tennessee. Every road in some counties was gone. Bridges collapsed. Cell towers went down. Grid power went dark. And within hours, not days, hours, the old system came back. Neighbors with ATVs started running medicine up the ridges. Retired nurses organized phone trees on whatever signal they could find. Churches turned into shelters overnight. Men with chainsaws cleared paths to houses where elderly people lived alone. Official help took days to arrive in some of those counties. The neighbors were there on day one. The Appalachian winter never really ended. The weather changed, the roads got paved, the smokehouses fell in. But the muscle memory of a century and a half of keeping each other alive through February got passed down quieter than anyone realized. It lives in the way an old man checks on his neighbor after an ice storm. It lives in the granny women's grandchildren who still know which route stops a cough. And it lives in the simple fact that when the roads went out in 2024, nobody in those hollows needed a handbook. They already had it memorized. This is where we end today's deep dive. For more hidden American history like this, go ahead and subscribe now, and tell me in the comments which forgotten place you want uncovered next. As always, we will see you in the past.